It's a chat about cars. It's some special cars selected throughout the day, and some special owners, drivers, restorers, designers. We just want to give you a bit of a flavor of what it's like to be around these cars. And so, up here on stage, I don't want to say it's my favorite, but a very special car, the Maserati 250F, a Grand Prix car. Grand Prix because at the time it wasn't called Formula One, it was called Grand Prix Racing. And I don't want to say it's the ultimate Grand Prix car, but certainly the ultimate front-engined Grand Prix car. But this one's special. This one is not just any Maserati 250F, not that there's very many in the world anyway, but this actual car, the car you have here in front of you, is the car that Stirling Moss himself, he was sitting in the car, drove at the Monaco Grand Prix and won in this Maserati 250F. He also raced it in Brazil, where he came second, but to have Stirling Moss's winning Maserati 250F Grand Prix car is something quite special. And we really wanted to try and give you an insight of what it's like to be in that time and what it's like to be behind the wheel of these cars. So if I can invite Mark Hales up with me to come and give us a bit of a flavour. Mark's a driver, writer, automotive, everything, absolutely deserved. He has raced more cars than he can remember. He has driven everything. He has written more articles than maybe he can remember. He will definitely give us a great insight into the world of the Maserati 250. Come up on stage. Let's come and stand next to the car. I don't even know where to start. Well, I'll tell you where we'll start. Tell us what you've driven, if it's possible, in a very condensed. Where did you start, and what have you driven? So give us a bit of a picture here.
Yes, I'll do my best. I've driven most things. At all levels. I started a long time ago and I'm still doing it. I built my own cars to start with, and then once I found that I was actually reasonably good at it, and people started asking, and at the same time then I became a journalist, and that provided other opportunities. So yeah, I've driven most things. At one point I think I had driven or raced more different types of car than anyone, certainly in this country.
That's quite impressive. So you've driven just about everything. Of course the question comes, and I know the answer, but maybe you don't. Have you driven, or I should say, when's the last time you drove, or have you driven a Maserati 250F Grand Prix car?
Yes, several in fact. Not this one, but one very much like it, owned by Nick Mason, the Pink Floyd musician. He's got, it's red, and it's very similar. So they tend to drive much the same, but as we discussed earlier, they need to be right.
They need to be right. So there's less than 30 of these cars in existence. Different to Ferrari at the time, Maserati decided or took the line of selling some cars to their very wealthy clients to be able to go Grand Prix racing. You know, don't forget, this is a Formula One car of its day. This is like having the Ferrari Formula One car, or Lewis Hamilton's Formula One car here. What is it like to drive? You should take the time to look. Well, the first thing that I have to tell you is that when you sit in the car, there's one pedal on the left, there's a massive transmission tunnel in the center, and there's two pedals on the right. So your feet are like this. What is it like to drive?
Okay, well, it's pretty physical because in those days there's no driver aids, there's no power steering, there's no power brakes. And of course you have to remember that a Grand Prix in 1956 could be anything, it could be over 3 hours, and in some cases they'd have to refuel. But yeah, it's physical, you end up with blisters on your hands, all that kind of stuff. The steering's very heavy, a lot of kickback, and the gearbox, you've got to reach down by your thigh because the gear change is there. And the interesting, the gearbox is in the back and the engine is in the front. And it was a layout that they were trying to spread the weight about the car. As the early cars, all the engine was in the front and the driver was right at the back. So then they ended up putting the driver much more in the middle, putting the gearbox at the back. Ferrari did the same. And then, of course, not long after this car had its heyday, they moved the engine behind, and that was something that the Brits did, John Cooper and Colin Chapman in particular, and that was the end of these. So this was the swan song of the front engine Grand Prix car.
Oh, the front engine, but it was quite famously, Stirling Moss had said, you know, don't forget, these cars were driven by Moss, by Fangio, by Jean Berra, by Ascari. It's the greats drove these cars, but wasn't it Stirling Moss that famously said you can steer it on the, not only with the steering but also on the throttle?
Yeah.
Is that right? Is that true?
It is true to some extent, but you don't kick the tail
You have to
out.
be Stirling Moss to do it.
Well, yeah, it is possible. And that's how you have to drive them, because they're not like a modern car. A modern car has got much more grip. If you look at the size of these tyres, they're tiny, and there's a McLaren in there with huge, sticky tyres. These didn't have a lot of grip, so you had to persuade the car to turn before you got to the corner. So you got it to rotate, and then you didn't so much as steer it on the throttle, you held it there. So you get the car to swivel, and then you'd pin it. And then you'd maintain the attitude all the way through the corner.
Really easy, right? All this with no seat belts, no roll bar, and at the time they were probably just wearing their t-shirts. I mean, dangerous, surely.
Fantastically dangerous. And they
Reassuring.
incredibly dangerous. The tracks were dangerous. There weren't very many race circuits as we know them in those days. A lot of this was on public roads, and you know, with all that entails. So you had houses and telephone poles and all sorts of things.
Things to bump into.
Things to hit. Yeah. So there's no such thing as runoff area, and there was no safety. So the drivers accepted when they went out that they might not come back. So in that respect, they were like soldiers.
So imagine again. I have to Stirling Moss sitting in this car, Monaco Grand Prix, which today is still a street circuit. Imagine, you know, how much risk he was taking. You drive these cars today. I don't see any seat belts. I don't see any roll bar. You told me how dangerous it is. Why drive it?
Well, one of the reasons they don't have seat belts was because there was an opinion at the time that if you were going to go off the road, it would be much better to be thrown out than to have the car roll over on top of you and then catch fire. So they didn't have seat belts. I remember I did share a sports car with Sterling, and I went to do up the belts, and he looked daggers at me because it's something that he still, to this day, absolutely hated. But it was extremely dangerous. So what you have a conversation with yourself. And also, all the top drivers have always been possessed of an enormous amount of self-belief. So it couldn't happen to them, could it? You know, they weren't going to make a mistake, so what could possibly go wrong? And so when you sit in it and you're about to go out, you can't be thinking what ifs. So you convince yourself that everything is going to be all right, and then you put it out of your mind. You don't think about it again, and they wouldn't have done either.
And I suppose in any time, even in modern day racing, if someone, a driver goes out, no matter how safe the cars are today, nobody goes out thinking, what if? You go out thinking, how do I beat the guy behind me? How do I set the fastest time? And I guess it's probably the similar mindset that you get into when you get in this car.
That's the only thing that matters. See, we look at this car now, and it's a thing of enormous beauty. For them, it was a working tool. You know, if it broke or they crashed it, they went and got another one. If they were a good enough driver, so they'd have wheeled in another one and say, here you are, don't break this one.
That's one thing that I'm glad you touched upon is just the beauty of this car. In the world of Grand Prix cars and in the world of collector cars, the Maserati 250F is considered to be one of the most beautiful Grand Prix cars ever designed, ever produced. It is more beautiful than any other Ferrari or any of its van walls, any of its competition at the time, and it's something that is accepted as the prettiest of all. It's slow, it's long, it's sleek. It's just
how a race car should look.
It's It's how a race car. You said to me earlier on, actually, it's a good point. If you take a piece of paper and you've never seen a race car, or a small child draws a race car, this is probably what you'll draw: a long nose.
That's what you doodle.
A round tail and two big wheels on the sides.
That's it. Yeah, and it wasn't complicated by aerodynamics, which it has been now. That's why they look so dreadful now. So there's no aerodynamics to this. The people who produced this also had an eye for styling as well. So they would want it to look nice, and also it was the fashion of the time. So the car that Ferrari made looked pretty similar. A lot of that was defined by where the engine was, where the driver was, and all that sort of thing, and the tyres that were available. So that would have defined the size of the wheels, all that sort of thing. And incidentally, we haven't talked about brakes. This has got drum brakes, like your Cortina, only bigger. And if you drove these cars, how you'd want to drive a modern car, you'd have no brakes.
Well, that's an interesting point you make. So you have a lot of experience driving a lot of these cars. You've driven this car. One of the great things is that today these cars still come out. They're hugely valuable. They're difficult to drive. But for example, this car is run by Hall and it goes out to Goodwood. It's out at Silverstone. It is actively raced and campaigned. If we were to put, let's say, Lewis Hamilton into this car, would he be able to drive it?
He wouldn't drive it. He'd refuse.
It's probably because it's too dangerous, and his contract says that he can't drive anything red.
Absolutely right.
However,
he can drive a Mercedes.
Right, let's take Vettel. It's closer to Maserati. How does a modern driver drive a car like this? Is it possible? How is it different?
Of course it's possible, because a driver is a driver. It's just that you have to learn. You have to learn how the car is different. And it's the same if you get into, if they've done some modifications on your modern Grand Prix car, and it's going to handle differently. You've got to find out what that is. So a driver is a driver, but they wouldn't be familiar with it, so they couldn't rely on the experience that they've already got, because it is so completely different. And because modern cars are all about the front end. You've got massive grip. You've got to get the front end into the corner, carrying as much speed as you possibly can. Don't drive these like this. And the other thing that people tend to forget is the circuits were different. Hung up to slow the modern cars down, otherwise they can take most of the track flat out now, because they've got such enormous grip. These didn't have any grip. And so, because there weren't so many hairpins, the brakes didn't matter so much, because you didn't use them that much. You just, they talk about pitching the car sideways. You don't do that either. You drift it, as I explained earlier. You share the grip out, not that there's much, but you share the grip out amongst all four tyres, rather than relying on the front to get the car in, and then the rears to squirt it out, which is how a modern car is driven.
That's where we get these great pictures of people like Fangio, and in this case, Sterling Moss, in this car, and you get these great pictures of them sort of just slightly sliding the back end of the car, and the photographer hanging out in the centre. I mean, mid to late 50s, it must have been quite the time, and they're just wearing a t-shirt and some kind of small helmet, if that at all.
Well, the early drivers didn't wear helmets. I mean, that came in later, and they just had a skull cap when they started. And Mike Hawthorne famously would race in a collar and tie, and quite a lot of the drivers did. So a lot of things have come in that we are now familiar with, but just didn't exist. It wasn't the culture of the time, and it hadn't occurred to them.
And so coming back to that time, now we're so used to, this is a Grand Prix car, and now we're so used to our Formula One drivers, the big stars. They focus on one car, one championship. It's just one objective in the year. Whereas I think you were telling me that someone like Sterling Moss or Fangio would drive many cars during the year. It wasn't just a Formula One driver.
Not necessarily, well, yes, during the year, but on the day as well, or over the weekend. When Graham Hill and Sterling Moss, at that time they were only just starting to get paid as well. I think Sterling Moss was famously one of the first people to get paid, and he once said that he would drive a Jaguar saloon, but they'd have to pay him. So they gave him a Jaguar instead. So, but they would drive over a weekend the Grand Prix drivers would drive something like this. Actually, it became more prevalent later because the championships, when they raced these sorts of cars, you didn't have lots of different races on at that weekend. But sort of come the 60s, you'd have Formula 2, sports cars, a saloon car race, and the Grand Prix. And people like Clark and Hill and Moss would drive all of them because they got paid more.
All right, Mark, I'm going to give you the impossible question. You've driven just about every...
Please don't ask me which is my favourite one.
Oh, God, all right. Which one do you enjoy driving the most? I'll narrow it down for you.
Okay.
Of the single-seaters.
And
you don't even, we won't even be disappointed if you don't say it's the 250F. I will be, but I'm sure they won't be disappointed.
The 250F, and you know, here's another thing. It looks so magnificent. And
it makes you look good in it.
Well, it makes you look good in it when you're sitting still. But like modern cars, they had to be right. So even though it looks wonderful and brilliant, if it's not adjusted correctly or there's something wrong with it, it would be deeply horrible. But you can't say that because it looks so magnificent. So which, I don't know.
Too difficult to answer.
Well, it's too difficult, but any racing driver will say, my favourite car is the one I can win in. And actually, you have to get back to that mentality that this is a working tool. It's a priceless artifact now, but it was a working tool then, and they wanted to win.
That's another thing that I'm always, you have done a lot of historic racing. I think you've won numerous Goodwood's TTs, haven't you?
3 today. Yeah.
Are you the one of the winningest? Can you say winningest drivers in the Goodwood TT? You can, especially when I say it about you.
Thank you, darling. Of the TT, yes, I think.
Don't be so modest. He's the winningest.
I was the only one to win it 3 times. I don't know whether anybody's done that since, but I was for a while.
But so you've driven a lot of the historic cars. When you get in a car like this, we talked about the safety angle, but what about value? Do you ever think about, gosh,
No.
this is a hugely valuable car? No. Obviously, it doesn't ever cross your mind.
Otherwise you wouldn't go out in it, because famously I've had my problems with things like that. But if you had that kind of mindset before you went out, you just wouldn't do it, because it's not worth the risk. So the moment you fire up the engine and leave the pits, all that goes out. The only thing I would say is that sometimes in a more modern race, you'll stick your nose where it shouldn't go and just think, right, I am coming through whether he likes it or not.
Maybe not in a 250F.
Maybe not in some, well, not in single-seaters generally, because otherwise you go flying. But certainly in something with bodywork around you, you're not going to force your way through in somebody's priceless artifact. And that's actually, in the nicest possible way, why I get asked to drive these things, because I won't do that. Not everybody is as polite.
Absolutely, you have to. At the end of the day, it is a piece of history. Again, I guess for me, I can't quite get over the fact that this is the Monaco Grand Prix winning car. So it is a piece of history.
Working tool.
It is very valuable, but the best is when you hear it running, when you're actually driving it, when you're at Goodwood and it goes by. That's when the car, I think, really comes alive, and that's when they're so different from each other.
Of course, it comes alive. I mean, somebody famously said, a Grand Prix driver, was it a Grand Prix driver? They only become alive when you fire them up and they start moving. Otherwise, they are just artifacts.
Especially in this era where all the spec of the cars were so different. This is a 6-cylinder, 2.5-liter engine, and that was the rule at the time with this tubular chassis. But if you went to Ferrari, you went to Van Wall, you went to all the different marks, everyone had their own interpretation. Today in our Formula 1 racing, all the cars are much more similar one to another. So
a lot of that is down to the regulations. The number of cylinders, for instance, is mandated in the modern car. And it's what they knew how to do. And Ferrari tried all sorts of things. The Ferrari, the Dino, that looks like this, has a V6. This is a straight 6, but it still had the gearbox in the back. yeah, they did
Similar but different.
similar but different, and they would try all sorts of different things. Maserati famously, in trying to extend the life of this particular model, and to deal with the oncoming threat from probably Germany, on the racetrack that is, they put a V12 in one of these because the one thing you needed was more power, not
Racing drivers always want more power. Well, Mark, thank you so much for sharing your insight, your stories, giving us a taste of what it's like to drive these cars. I hope you've enjoyed admiring and looking at the 250F, the car that, in my opinion, is one of the most beautiful Grand Prix cars ever
Agreed.
made. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.